Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Timberwolves have signed this year's draft picks, Leonard Miller and Jaylen Clark. I'll break down those contracts and why both were smart decisions by the Wolves, the structure of the contracts. Also, the Timberwolves won their opener in Las Vegas on Friday. Talking a little bit about how Josh Minott and Leonard Miller both starred. Also, thoughts on Wendell Moore Jr.'s performance and some other Timberwolves players that stood out. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Of course, you can watch this show also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can download on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, I want to start the show today by talking about the contracts that Leonard Miller and Jaylen Clark both signed late last week and into the weekend, and then we'll get to the Las Vegas opener. I think the contracts are an important thing to start with because, I mean, nowadays there's a big question. Second-round contracts used to be less mysterious. It was a lot of draft and stashes. It was a lot of completely non-guaranteed deals. But nowadays, in part because of the introduction of two-way contracts a few years ago, and also just because teams have been more creative and they've realized, like, hey, if we hit on these picks, we can get some really effective players on fixed costs, right? Like, we have cost certainty for future years if we're right about these players. And the Wolves basically did that with both of these. Well, I guess they really only did it with Leonard Miller, but both contract signings were, I thought the Wolves did the right thing. So let's start with Jaylen Clark. Of course, Jaylen Clark tore his Achilles last spring, or a few months ago, I guess this spring, and isn't going to play at all in this calendar year. May get to some basketball activities early next calendar year in 2024. But the Timberwolves, rather than signing him to a deal and eating up a roster spot, they just signed him to a two-way deal, which makes a ton of sense. And it allows him to work his way back at whatever speed. There's no pressure. By the way, I should say, I missed this on the show last week. I forgot to mention that the Timberwolves, every team now can have 3 two-way deals. So Luka Garza already came back on one. Instead of just a second one to fill, they've actually got 2 to fill. So one of them is Jaylen Clark, which with essentially that bonus two-way deal, if you will. So there's no pressure on him to get back because he's eating up one of the 15 roster spots. And when he comes back, they can just option him to the G League. If he comes back, say he's able to play next April or whatever, which is probably a stretch, they can just put him in the G League or get practice with the G League team, whatever, and there's no pressure for him to perform at the NBA level. So I thought that made a ton of sense, and it also makes sense. They're also not guaranteeing him any dollars, right? And it's not like he has a whole lot of leverage either, because obviously he's going to sign a deal. He's going to get paid decently on a two-way contract, right? It's not like you're just playing in the G League. But the Wolves don't have to guarantee him a minimum salary or whatever because they don't know how he's going to recover. Like, say he has a terrible setback or he just doesn't, whatever. They could just let him go next summer and no harm, no foul in terms of the cap. And you don't have to deal with it in that sense. Now, hopefully that's not the case. And of course, Chris Finch has already talked about how they believe that Jaylen Clark was the best defender, point of attack defender, I think, or maybe perimeter defender is how he put it, in the draft this year. Or maybe that might have been Tim Connolly. I think Finch basically said something similar, but Connolly said it post-draft. So the Wolves, clearly, they think highly of Jaylen Clark, and I do too, actually. He was the player that if you listen to any of my pre-draft shows, he was the one that I highlighted as who I wanted them to target with their pick. Sure enough, they got him. And so I'm excited for Jaylen Clark to come back healthy. And, the hope is that that's the case and perhaps even sees the floor next spring. But in addition to picking him at 53, the Wolves also acquired pick number 33 by trading 2 future second-round picks to the Spurs. And they took Leonard Miller. And Leonard Miller, we'll talk a lot about his debut performance in a Timberwolves uniform, kind of, in Las Vegas Summer League on Friday. And excited to watch him play again Monday night, tonight. on ESPNU. It's a 9 p.m. tip this evening, and we'll talk, of course, about that on the postgame pod Tuesday. But I was curious to see what the Wolves would do contract-wise for Leonard Miller. And they had a bit of a blueprint. Like, you go back a couple of years, well, I guess now 4 years ago, when the Timberwolves drafted Jaylen Noel in the second round, they signed Naz Reid as an undrafted free agent, and they signed them to, I believe, identical deals. And basically the way it worked is the first year of the contract was fully guaranteed. And then the second year, it was almost like the end of or the final couple of years of a first round contract, only with just the 1 year guaranteed. But then the second year was non-guaranteed. They just had to pick up the option. I think it was like February of the rookie season or whatever. So, I think it was partially guaranteed and it became fully guaranteed during the season. So the Wolves would have the option to, like, say halfway through Jaylen Noel's second season, they're like, let's save a few $100,000 and cut him loose. Instead, they could fully guarantee it. And he got some security, knowing that year one was fully guaranteed. He made like $1.4 million that first year, and year two is partially guaranteed. So there's another few $100,000, and very likely it will end up fully guaranteed. So that was one blueprint. The Wolves went a little further with Leonard Miller, reportedly. Now, they haven't announced this. They did, I believe, they announced the Jaylen Clark deal. They haven't announced Leonard Miller. But Darren Wolfson of KSTP in the Twin Cities and Score North reported that the Timberwolves gave him a 4-year deal with 2 years fully guaranteed. And he said 2+ guaranteed on Twitter. We don't have all the details, the full write-up on this, but this would imply years 1 and year 2 are guaranteed, and there's a partial guarantee as part of year 3, likely with an in-season opt-out or not opt-out, but a full guarantee date, right? So the Timberwolves will give him the first 2 years. Somewhere in the middle of year 3, and I'm guessing on the timing, is when that deal would become fully guaranteed for year 3, and probably the same for year 4. So say he's disappointing and struggles in year 1 and or year 2, the Wolves would only be on the hook for a portion of whatever his deal ends up being in year 3. Otherwise, the Wolves get a bargain. Say he's productive. Say he ends up as a rotation guy in year 2 of his NBA career. What would that be? 24, 25. Then they get a steal for years 3 and 4 of the contract. Exactly what the Wolves got for Naz Reid the last 2 years, and what they felt like they had in year 3 with Jaylen Noel, and obviously he struggled in year 4. But that's the blueprint here, right? They're trying to do the exact same thing that Gerson Rosas did with Reid and Noel, and what Tim Connolly did with Monty Morris, and also to a much larger extent with Nikola Jokic in Denver. But it's that cost certainty. It's just such a smart use of assets if you're right on your draft pick, and clearly the Wolves feel pretty good about what they're doing with Leonard Miller, or about that selection and trading a couple of future assets to get a second round pick and select him at 33. So this is likely a very savvy signing, and good on Leonard Miller to get a couple of guaranteed years, despite slipping to the second round, to get a couple of guaranteed years on the salary. Remember, there were a lot of analysts that had a first round grade on Leonard Miller. He slips to number 33. The Wolves give him a couple years guaranteed as an early second round pick, and then some partial guarantees reportedly for years 3 and 4. So very savvy. The Wolves still have that third 2-way contract available and one roster slot available. They've only got they're like $2.5 million or so underneath the cap. So, or I guess the second salary apron. It's about $2.5 million, right? So it's probably a vet minimum contract, which gives them a few $100,000 wiggle room. I think vet minimums are right around $2 million. So we don't know what that'll be. It could be an Austin Rivers. It could be, I doubt it, but it could be Nate Knight. It could be a familiar face, or it could be somebody completely different. But now we know what the Wolves are doing with their draft picks from this year, and Jaylen Clark on the 2-way, Leonard Miller on the full guarantee for the first 2 years of the deal. But he'll be one of those 15 roster spots this season. All right. Speaking of Leonard Miller, let's talk about his summer league debut in Las Vegas. I want to hit the big names for the Wolves, the draft picks, right? Josh Minott, last year's draft pick, Leonard Miller, Wendell Moore Jr. from last year's draft. I want to talk about them, and then we'll also hit on a couple of the other guys that stood out in game 1 of Las Vegas Summer League. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Ibotta. If you're picking up burgers and hot dogs for summer barbecue, you know you're already doing it, so why not get cash back for it at the store with Ibotta? Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop and get your cash back. It's that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 back per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip. Or you could just use your cash back to buy the flight you've been eyeing, the game you're dying to go to, or the fancy dinner that you might be craving. Other apps give you points that don't amount to much. With Ibotta, you get real cash back. You can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. You can earn cash back on hundreds of online brands and retailers too. And you start with Ibotta. That includes Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED when you register. Nothing to lose. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app. Use the code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, Ibotta, in the Google Play or App Store, and use the code LOCKED. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every day we are still daily throughout this week and actually throughout the month of July. We'll keep talking Summer League. The Wolves have 4 more games, I believe, on the schedule in the preliminary round. They'll play over the weekend in the quote-unquote tournament as part of Las Vegas Summer League. So lots of Wolves Summer League for the next 10 days or so. That's mostly what we'll focus on. And, of course, any other contract news like we covered off the top of the show here today. And then we'll get into the rest of the offseason. We'll do some segments with hosts of other shows to talk about, hopefully, Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton, new Timberwolves players. We'll talk to those hosts from Locked On Lakers and Sixers, respectively. And perhaps some more Towns trade talk if there's other teams that want to discuss what they would give up for Karl-Anthony Towns. I think those are always interesting conversations. But plenty to get to here still the rest of the month as the offseason continues on for the Timberwolves. All right, the Timberwolves won their first Las Vegas Summer League game on Friday. This was Friday afternoon. The Timberwolves ended up beating the New Orleans Pelicans Summer League entry by 14, 102-88. It was, in true Summer League fashion, extremely sloppy. New Orleans had 29 turnovers. They had a couple of NBA players similar to the Wolves, like Dyson Daniels played, and actually, we'll talk about this, gave Wendell Moore Jr. a bit of a tough time. E.J. Liddell, draft pick from last year, played. I really liked him as a draft prospect just over a year ago. For the Wolves, I want to start with I'm not going to do like game flow takeaways, stuff like I would do for a regular season game, because there isn't really a game flow to Summer League. Oftentimes it was a game of runs, as it often is. Again, 29 Pelicans turnovers. The Wolves actually had 19 of their own. So it was a whole thing in terms of the actual game. But in terms of individual performances, I want to start with the names that we were most excited to watch. And I spent Friday's show talking about those names. And that's, of course, last year's first-round pick, Wendell Moore Jr., last year's second-round pick, Josh Minott, and this year's second-round pick, Leonard Miller. Also, Mateo Spagnuolo, who was a second-round pick last year, played in Summer League and is back stateside for this. But I think Dane Moore had said on Twitter that he had heard that Spagnuolo was dealing with an injury, and sure enough, he didn't play in the game. So that could be why. So no Spagnuolo to talk about. But we'll start with let's actually start with Josh Minott, because I thought he overall played the best and I was most encouraged. I also think he's the quickest one, or the one with the quickest path, I guess, if you will, to finding regular season minutes with the Wolves rotation. Like I've talked about the Timberwolves 10-man depth chart right now. I think Josh Minott's number 11. Like I think he's right outside that. And if there's an injury early on, I think he's a rotation guy. I think he has the potential to fill that Taurean Prince-like role, which now is essentially Nickeil Alexander-Walker. But Minott brings some different things to the table, right? It's the size, the athleticism, the wingspan, and it's a bit more, really, him versus Nickeil Alexander-Walker, it's more size, and also he's more of a big in terms of how he would play, whereas Alexander-Walker is going to play on the ball a little bit more and does a little bit more offensively. But Minott, I think, has a bit of a higher ceiling as kind of a do-stuff type player. In this game, Minott finished with 20 points, 4 rebounds. He was 7 of 13 shooting, missed his only 2 3-point attempts. He was also 6 of 6 from the free throw line, though, which is encouraging. 2 assists, 2 blocks. He did commit 6 fouls, although you need to commit like a million fouls to foul out of a Summer League game. I believe that's still the case. 2 blocks, 2 steals. Sorry, 2 blocks, 2 assists, 1 steal, just 2 turnovers in 28 minutes played. And we talked about on Friday with Minott, I wanted to see more point of attack defense. I wanted to see what his jumper looked like. I also wanted to see half court feel. I think we saw good half court feel from Josh Minott in this game. I was really impressed with what he was able to do in the half court. In addition to the activity, he had a couple. There was one possession where he had a block and kind of scored on the other end in the fast break, and that was impressive. But to me, it's like, how comfortable is he in the half court? Can he be somebody who does multiple things, who can be a cutter, who can knock down a spot up shot. We know he's going to be a solid defender. We know he's going to be active on the glass. And that to me is the most important thing, because coming into last year, he had a relatively limited college career. He was a one and done. He played like 33 games at Memphis, but the actual minutes per game, he didn't start consistently, was low. And so we didn't know what that was going to translate to as a professional. And in limited minutes last year, he looked the part. The question is, in an expanded role, how comfortable is he in the half court? And again, the efficiency shooting the ball, the athleticism and activity around the rim on both ends of the floor are huge. If he could just play in the dunker spot, he's got, I think, better hands, better athleticism than, say, Jared Vanderbilt from a couple of years ago. The offensive upside is far greater, I think, than what Jared Vanderbilt's is, and he can play a very specific role. Vando was so limited because his hands were so limited and because his shooting range was extremely limited. Minott has range out to the three-point line. He can shoot threes. It's not pretty yet in terms of percentage, but he has the ability to do it, and there's more tools, better touch, again, better hands, things to suggest that could come. And he showed all of that in this summer league game against the Pelicans. And again, that line, and also, of course, he had the interview with Chris B. Haynes afterwards when he corrected, I wouldn't say passive aggressively. It was a fairly aggressive correction of the pronunciation of his name. It's not Josh Minott or whatever he said. It's Josh Minott, right? Like the city in North Dakota. So I'm most excited about him. I truly think, I've said this on the show before, I think he's more of a 3-4 hybrid version of Brandon Clark with the Memphis Grizzlies. And the upside with him, because of the nose for the ball, the rebounding, the athleticism, et cetera, is so high. And I was really impressed with him in this game and look forward to watching him, throughout summer league. But to me, he was the brightest star in this game. Leonard Miller, of course, who we just spent a lot of time talking about in the first segment, was super active on the glass, was even more efficient with the ball in his hands than Josh Minott. 16 points, 11 rebounds, shot 7 of 11 from the field, 2 of 4 from threes. One was kind of a half court heave. So 2 of 3 in the half court on 3-point attempts. The jumper doesn't look pretty. We talked about this post draft, but it goes in a decent amount of the time. The percentage still needs to go up if he's going to shoot with regularity as a rotation player at the NBA level. But the shot, he hit a nice pick and pop 3. Again, 11 rebounds, 5 were offensive. Activity around the rim for him too, just like Josh Minott. 2 assists, 2 steals, 1 block, 2 turnovers. He also was pretty good defensively. He had some nice wall ups, some nice rotations, a good nose for the ball on defense. Didn't commit a single personal foul, which some of the time isn't good because it shows a lack of activity and aggression. I didn't feel that from Leonard Miller in this game. I thought he was aggressive. And actually in game, Chris Finch, of course, the Timberwolves head coach, talked to the broadcast on NBA TV. And I'm just going to read this quote. He said I'll paraphrase a little bit. I just have notes on it. But Finch said about Leonard Miller that they really liked his feel. I talked about feel being important for Josh Minott. And I said this post-draft about Leonard Miller, and I think he's got feel. He needs to show it offensively with the ball in his hands. But Finch talked about on the broadcast, he mentioned the word feel like 3 times in his answer about his natural feel and his nose for the ball. And what I've kind of coined on this podcast is his do stuff ability. He's going to do all those extra things. The other thing I love that Finch pointed out was his rebounding at the G League level is very transferable to the NBA. Like he said something like it's like 99% of the time, if you rebound in the G League, you're going to rebound at an elite level in the NBA, or at least at a competitive level in the NBA. But the feel, essentially his ambidextrousness with the ball in his hands, both dribbling and passing, is so huge. And that was all on display in this game. Again, 16 and 11 on 7 of 11 shooting in this game. 7 of 11 shooting, made a couple of threes, 2 assists, 2 steals, a block, and didn't commit a foul, but still was active on both ends of the floor. I think this was kind of proof as to why the Wolves would guarantee 2 years of his contract. You could plug him right now into a game and he does a little bit of everything. And as long as he stays within himself, and he's already talked so much in his press conference to the media about his motivation. He talked about picking number 33 because he was the 33rd pick, wanting to be motivated. He believes in himself as long as he stays within himself and doesn't try and do too much when he gets the opportunity in an NBA game, because that role is going to change, right? Like the first time he steps in an NBA court in a regular season game, they're not going to ask him to go score, to go put up 16 and 11. It's going to be, hey, play this role, get after it, have a nose for the ball, play your role, And then maybe down the road, he becomes a 6-man type, right? Like, I think he has the ability in my mind to be um, a more fluid and athletic Kyle Anderson, that type of a player where he does a little bit of everything. I think he's going to be, he certainly has more natural athleticism. The question is, will he play the role as well as Kyle Anderson does? And I think the ceiling is probably higher, which is saying a lot. Kyle Anderson's a really good player. He's making whatever the Wolves are paying him this year, and he's essentially a starting caliber / 6-man type guy. Leonard Miller, I think that's a pretty reasonable outcome, is a more athletic version of a Kyle Anderson. And I talked on the show a couple weeks ago about there being Jared Vanderbilt similarities. And I know I just made that comparison with Minott, but that's more in terms of role than type of player. I think Miller, like being somewhere between a Vanderbilt and a Kyle Anderson, being more skilled than Vanderbilt, but have the athleticism and size more of Vanderbilt than say Kyle Anderson. Some sort of hybrid between those two, as weird as that is, and as different of two players as those guys are. I think that's perfectly reasonable. All right, let's close by talking Wendell Moore Jr., last year's first-round pick, what he did in this game. It wasn't all roses for Moore. And then also just a couple thoughts on the rest of the roster, so we'll do that here next. All right, last year's first-round pick, Wendell Moore Jr., he had some good moments at the NBA level. We talked about this on Friday's show, previewing the Summer League. Good defensive moments, struggled offensively at the NBA level, was actually a little more spotty even in the G League, I thought. But he's kind of that Swiss Army knife type player. The way I described him after he was drafted was a two-way role player, if that makes sense, right? We always talk about two-way players. Like Jimmy Butler's the quintessential two-way player. Anthony Edwards is becoming that, where like you're great on both ends of the floor. You can do it all. Wendell Moore Jr. is not going to be Anthony Edwards. He's not going to be Jimmy Butler, right? He's not going to be Dwayne Wade. But I think he can do everything and do it all at a good enough level to be considered a true two-way role player. Right now, he's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. And that's not the worst thing when you're a rotation guy. And actually, Chris Finch talked about this too on the broadcast during Summer League. He said something to the effect of like, hey, we think he can do a little bit of everything. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what I've said. And what is the phrase? I'm going to see if I can find the phrase that he used to describe him. Man, I lost it. But Finch talked about him. I think he called him a glue guy. He said something about him. Utility infielder. It was a baseball reference, saying that Wendell Moore Jr. was a utility infielder, connective tissue. A lot of the same ways he talks about Kyle Anderson. Remember, he called Kyle Anderson a Swiss Army knife last year in the fall, like leading into the season. Wendell Moore Jr. is like the guard version of that, where he's an above average defender. He can handle the ball. He's a pretty good passer. He can shoot it a little. He can get to the basket. He's not great at any of these things, but he's passable to good at all of them, right? So there's still upside. There's still development. You'd love him to be a better catch and shoot guy, to be like a true 3-and-D player. But his offensive game is more than just being a shooter, because he's also not a great shooter, right? So he has to do other stuff. So I like that description of him as a utility infielder or a connective tissue for the team, because he has the ability to do a little bit of everything. We unfortunately did not see that in this game. We saw him miss a ton of shots. He got off to a terrible start early in the game. 5 of 18 overall shooting, 3 of 12. He struggled with Dyson Daniels, who's an NBA talent, of course, with the Pelicans. And so he gave him a tough time. Daniels did guarding more. So Moore finished again, 5 of 18, which is barely over 25% shooting, 3 of 12 from outside the arc. 6 assists, which is nice, to just 2 turnovers. He had 4 rebounds, a steal, and a block, which 4 rebounds in 28 minutes for a 2-guard essentially is nice. So he did some good things. The activity on the glass, I thought the activity defensively was good. The willingness to shoot, great. But shot selection is going to be key. And I'm sure he feels some pressure, is like, hey, I'm the only first-round pick on this roster. Like in Summer League, I have to go and show out. I have to prove that I should be that 11th guy or whatever when it comes to regular season NBA basketball for the actual Timberwolves. But I think from a fan perspective, the expectations are higher for Leonard Miller at this point. Like, more eyes are on him, and also Josh Minott, than they even are for Moore. And I would say of the 3, Moore is probably the last one to see rotation minutes this year, unless it's simply, there's injuries or something else that forces Moore into the rotation. But he's behind Shake Milton. He's behind Troy Brown. He's behind Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And I would argue he's behind Josh Minott. Different positions, but pecking order wise, like, he's just got to take a breath and show that he can do a little bit of everything, and he's comfortable being that Swiss Army knife type, that connective tissue player here throughout Las Vegas Summer League. So keep an eye on Wendell Moore Jr. and see if he's able to do that over the next few games throughout the week. I had talked in the preview last week, I think it was Thursday's show, I talked about non-roster guys is what I was calling them, guys that aren't under contract with the actual Timberwolves. Trevion Williams, former Purdue big, was a little bit disappointing. He started and played 20 minutes, had 6 points, was just 2 of 7 shooting, took a couple of threes that he missed. He did have 5 assists, and that's his thing, right? Is he's a passer. He tied for second on the team in assists in this game, was arguably the best passer in basketball, or in the draft, I should say, a couple of years ago when he went undrafted. 5 assists, 2 turnovers, only had 3 rebounds, but he needs to rebound the ball and be a good passer and make the most of his offensive opportunities. I liked him as like, if he shows out and the Wolves say they think they need more big depth, you still got that two-way available. I thought there was an outside chance he could fight for that. Didn't do a whole lot in this game. Faron Hunt, who has been on a couple of 10-day deals, got into a couple games with the Knicks last year, played 13 minutes, was quiet. You know, he can defend. He didn't do anything offensively, only logged 1 rebound, so that was quiet. Brian Bowen II, this is like at least his second, if not his third year on the Summer League entry for the Wolves. He's a former two-way player for the Pacers back during the first, I think it was the first year of two-way contracts. He was good, 10 points and 4 or 5 shooting, 3 rebounds. He's clearly a pro. Like you could tell, he's played a lot of professional basketball. Speaking of, Brandon Williams is the other one. Talked a lot about him Thursday too. He played a bunch of games for the Blazers, started a bunch of games for Portland a couple of years ago, back when they were essentially tanking at the end of the year when Dame was hurt. Not this last year, but the year prior, the 21-22 season, and had a good game against the Wolves at the end of that year. Last year, bounced around a little bit, played some G League, not super efficient offensively, a little undersized. He played at Arizona a long time ago, left in 2019, tried to go pro, had some injuries. Anyway, he was clearly a pro too, right? Like Brandon Williams and Brian Bowen, like you look at those guys, be like, okay, they've played in the NBA before, right? That's kind of what you can tell. It's one of those differences versus all these other guys who have only played college ball, like a Chris Bankston or DJ Carton. Well, I guess Carton played in the G League. Philip Wheeler played in the G League. But you look at those guys, you go, okay, they're pros. They know what they're doing. Brandon Williams, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of his game. I wouldn't be all that psyched if the Wolves filled out the roster with him. But remember, they've got a spot and they've got a two-way spot, a regular spot and a two-way spot. I'd be shocked if you got a regular spot because you still have Jordan McLaughlin, you have Shake Milton. Alexander Walker can run offense. You don't need a 6'2" point guard or whatever he is. But the two-way slot, it wouldn't be that surprising. They've got Garza and they've got an injured player in Jaylen Clark. So maybe if they like him in Summer League, that's a possibility. I'd be a little bit surprised though if he ended up with the Wolves. But anyway, for 24 points and 8 of 14 shooting, 7 of 9 at the line, 1 of 3 outside the arc, 3 assists, 3 steals, only 1 turnover, a couple of rebounds for Brandon Williams. He actually led the team in minutes played, or I guess tied with Wendell Moore Jr. in minutes played. So keep an eye on him. If he has a fantastic Summer League, I mean, somebody will pick him up, right? And he's clearly got talent, even if he's not. He's more of one of those more higher volume guards, and I'm not sure that's what the Wolves are necessarily looking for. But it should be fun to watch him play the rest of the Summer League as well. So again, Monday night, 9 p.m. ESPNU this time around, I believe. And actually, I don't have in front of me who they're playing. Not that it matters that much, but anyway. So Monday night, the Jazz, 9 p.m. on ESPNU. So Tuesday show will be a post-game pod from that game Monday. The Wolves don't play Tuesday. They play again, I believe, Wednesday. So Thursday will be a post-game pod and on down. But we'll do every day this week. We are still daily. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. To those everydayers out there, it is greatly appreciated that you stick with the show throughout the offseason. So plenty upcoming still this month. Of course, you can listen to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can watch on YouTube. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.